This is Nikki Casey with Matt Connerton, Unleashed in the Afternoon, and I am here with U.S. Senator Maggie Hassan here in Manchester at the opening of her office. Maggie, I'm just wondering, how will the cuts to the social services under the Trump budget impact the recovery community in cities like Manchester?
Well, I am very concerned about what we've seen from President Trump in terms of his budget proposals, as well as some of the other proposals that will undermine prevention, treatment, recovery, and law enforcement efforts in New Hampshire and around the country when it comes to substance misuse. So the effort that the White House and the Republicans in the House made to repeal the Affordable Care Act would have repealed our bipartisan Medicaid expansion program in New Hampshire, which has been critical in providing substance misuse treatment. Similarly, his proposed budget, which we are told is just a draft, makes really deep cuts, for instance, to the National Institutes of Health, which does critical research on substance misuse and on the type of practices we know we need to engage in to help people in recovery. And then there are other budgets that he has proposed making really drastic cuts to our community development block grant programs, for instance, which provide such critical funding for affordable housing. And one of the things we know is really important for people in recovery is to have housing options. So all across the board, it's a particularly challenging and difficult budget for those of us who are trying to fight this epidemic and help people get to recovery. Last thing I'd mention is the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, if it were successful, would have repealed something called essential health benefits. What that really is a requirement that private insurers as well as public programs actually cover substance misuse treatment. So if you have private coverage, we think it should cover all illnesses, and substance misuse is an illness and it needs to be covered. And so the president's proposals in that regard are very, very troubling. You know, the president has talked a lot about how moved he was by seeing the impact of the heroin, opioid, and fentanyl epidemic in New Hampshire when he was here as a candidate. And the problem is that his actions so far haven't lived up to those words. So we will keep pushing to make sure that we have the resources we need here in New Hampshire and around the country to help people beat this disease and then get stronger.
Thank you very much. This is Nikki.
Oh, and that was a great clip. That was Nikki Casey's interview with Senator Maggie Hassan. I am your host tonight of the QCC. I'm Elizabeth Ropp. John Hopwood is out of the country. We are going to do a show tonight on the topic of harm reduction in New Hampshire. So I've got some great guests. I've got Ryan Fowler with
Granite Pathways
in Portsmouth.
We're based out of Concord. We're a statewide organization under FedCap. A lot of what we do is the regional access point services. We field calls from the statewide addiction crisis line. So essentially, when individuals need help with substance use disorder, they can call 1-844-711-HELP, and they talk to someone such as myself.
Great. And we also have the Honorable Representative Elizabeth Edwards. Hi. And you'll be, further on in the show, you're going to be talking about your bill that is in the process right now.
Yep, and also just general harm reduction, the Harm Reduction Coalition that's starting up in New Hampshire, and some programming that they have planned and how you can get involved.
Right, and we have activists from Philadelphia, we have Melanie, and we have Eris. And so further on the show, you're going to be talking about the work that you're doing with Representative Edwards on it's the sex workers decriminalization bill?
Well, yeah, it's actually just a study committee bill to look at alternatives to the current system of full criminalization of sex work,
right,
and the costs and benefits of the current approach and also alternative approaches that we might use.
Right. And you're working on bringing that into the bigger umbrella of harm reduction here in New Hampshire. So
yeah.
Tell us more about the Harm Reduction Coalition, because I've only made it to one meeting and it was because you brought me there.
Yeah, so I'd say that the beginning of the Harm Reduction Coalition as a real organization started with Dr. Joe Hannon's bill to create syringe service programs in New Hampshire, which is obviously something that lots of people have been working on in New Hampshire for decades at this point. Last term, Dr. Hannon was the prime sponsor on a bill that ultimately came to fruition this year, and lots of other people who were major players in getting that to happen were like Dr. Kevin Irwin, who has a long history of advocating for syringe service programs and harm reduction, not just in New Hampshire, but across the country, and also Dean Lemire, who's a very active harm reduction advocate. And so, and you'll notice that a lot of these people are from the Seacoast. And so what I go to their meetings, and my hope is to be able to replicate the syringe service programs, which are just now starting up now that we have the HHS guidelines for those, and be able to bring that to Manchester and to Hillsborough County, because we need it just as much, if not more, than Stratford County.
So the Clean Needle Exchange Bill passed, but it's only functioning right now on the Seacoast? Is that?
No, sorry. Do you want to take that question? I can.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, sure. Okay, so the Harm Reduction Coalition is now active, and they have a website, nhrc.org. And they have a Facebook page, and they have even a nonprofit which has taken them under their wing so that they can do funding that way. And they have a board of directors, I believe. So it's like, but these are all like the beginning stages of a broader coalition in New Hampshire to focus on harm reduction. Should I explain what harm reduction is really
Absolutely.
briefly? Okay.
Harm reduction has been around, that term has been around at least since, the 70s or 80s, and I feel like it's a very new concept here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, sure. So all of life carries risk, but some activities are riskier than others. For people in, I'd say, like our general age cohort, some of the riskiest things we can do are driving in cars and using intravenous drugs. But lots of other things carry risks, like hiking and weightlifting and, riding a motorcycle without a helmet. So harm reduction is just saying people are going to behave how they're going to behave. Can we give them the tools to be safer doing those things? Can we reduce the harm of dangerous behavior, whether that's encouraging people, please wear your seatbelt, please get vaccinated, or in the case of the heroin epidemic, it's giving the people the tools to avoid lifelong or extremely expensive diseases like HIV infection, giving them clean needles, possibly giving them, providing safe injection sites. And I think in New Hampshire, the trick to doing that is getting the state government to to say, like, this is how you can do this, and we're not going to stop you from doing this, and then allowing municipalities and private organizations and charities to take over, because there's like no funding. Like, for example, the needle exchange, or excuse me, the syringe service program, which is the preferred nomenclature these days. That bill passed, and the only funding in it is just for HHS to collect data. That's it. There's no money for needles, for syringes, for anything in the bill. It all has to come from us. It has to come from donations, or municipalities and towns are allowed to also start them up under this bill. So that's a challenge. That fundraising is a challenge, and getting volunteers and getting that education out there. And while I'm on the topic of education, may I share?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is an event which you can find out about by going, if you're interested in the effort to bring syringe service programs to New Hampshire, which are badly needed. There is an event that the Harm Reduction Coalition is putting on, and you need to register on Eventbrite, but it's free, and it is Friday, September 22nd from 1 to 3:30 p.m. In Concord. So I want as many people as possible to go to this program, and I know it's hard because it is on a weekday.
In the middle of the day, yeah.
But and we're going to talk about, Kevin Irwin and other people from the Harm Reduction Coalition are going to talk about everything you need to know to get syringe service programs in your community.
Right.
And this is really about reducing the incidence of disease and injury and infection from reusing needles.
Because I think that's the question. I was explaining this
Yeah.
to my esthetician. I was telling her about this bill. And, about
That
the.
is a community conversation.
Yeah, she's waxing my legs, and I'm telling her about the clean needle exchange bill.
Yeah.
And my eyebrows too, of course.
Yeah.
And she's saying, wait a minute, isn't this just going to encourage people to use more? And aren't you just giving people, something to help them use rather than giving them help to recover? And I said, well, you're going to prevent disease from spreading first and foremost.
And it is a valid question, and it's a question that a lot of people have. They want to know, will increased availability of clean needles, and of course, accepting dirty needles and saying you can turn in your dirty needles, you won't be arrested for turning in dirty needles. Will this exchange concept, does it increase drug use? And it's a valid question, and luckily there's a lot of science. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of data to answer this question. Syringe service programs are not a new concept. And we can say no. In fact, that people, when they have access to healthcare, when the stigma is a little bit less, when they can, when there's like peer-to-peer conversations about the dangers of reusing needles, that can turn into a healthy relationship where then people feel safe getting treatment.
Right.
And so, in fact, drug abuse goes down when we have strong, robust harm reduction programs like syringe service programs in place. So it's a valid question, and thankfully there's a lot of data, and the data says, nope, drug use does not go up.
Right.
And in fact, it goes down.
And so are you accepting dirty needles, or should I use the word dirty?
Use
syringes.
Yeah.
Are you accepting them where you work, or are you not doing that yet?
So at some of the recovery centers that I've been at, up until this bill passed, we were essentially telling people to take used syringes and to put them in a used detergent container and just throw them away. That's unsanitary. It's not good for the environment. It could potentially cause more harm than good. But up until this wonderful bill was passed, we really had nothing to do with these used syringes. And working in the field of recovery for folks with substance use disorder, I'm excited to see this bill to usher more people into treatment. I spent 7 months working with Manchester's Safe Station program, working directly with individuals who were lacking human connection. They had not seen any sort of medical professional or clinician in quite a long time. And to see firsthand what those infections from intravenous drug use look like, it really... I'm not going to elaborate on that, but people need access to clean syringes, clean works, whatever drugs they're using, in order to avoid some of the harm that's involved. And, any way to get folks into treatment, we at, Granite Pathways are fully supportive of this measure.
Yeah, I met a harm reduction program director in Vermont when I was doing an acupuncture detoxification specialist training with this specialist who helped me pass the acupuncture detox bill. And she had sharps containers in her car that she had to drive around with. And I kept thinking, okay, she needs harm reduction because she doesn't need anything spilling in her car.
Yeah.
But I liked the fact that here she was learning to be an acupuncture detoxification specialist as the director of a harm reduction program. And I'm hoping ultimately that's going to go under the large umbrella of harm redution as well.
Yeah, holistic
Yep.
interaction with the situation as opposed to
Right.
using methadone and all of the, like Haldol and other really strong
Suboxone, right.
Yeah.
So-
Although methadone and Suboxone do have their places, sometimes that's what people
Right.
need to quit.
We can't hear you. I think you need to get a little
Oh,
closer to the
sorry. That
microphone.
is what I just wanted to add that methadone and Suboxone do have their place.
Right.
You know, Elizabeth and I sometimes talk about how we want the treatment toolbox to be big,
as big as
you know.
possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many other states have the clean needle exchange bill? Are we really late coming to the table on this in New Hampshire?
We're pretty late to the table. I think from my perspective, it's one of the better programs because there are states that have a variety, some kind of variant on a syringe service program bill, but it's like it's too restrictive, or it requires drug users to carry IDs, like identifying them as
I've
a
heard of
member
this.
of the program. And a lot of people in the drug using community are not comfortable taking those measures and carrying around an ID that says, like, I'm one of those people who you read the union leader comments and they think you should, just keel over instead of getting better. And it's so I think that there are a lot of bad, or let me just say, suboptimal syringe service programs around the country, and some very good ones. And that, funding aside, New Hampshire was lucky to, not lucky, it was through a lot of hard work to get a pretty good program.
Do you know, in the state of Pennsylvania, do you have really good laws? Do you know what your laws are like there for clean needle exchange?
Pretty thorough as far as I know.
You might need to lean into the microphone. Sorry.
I was confirming with Melanie that it was pretty thorough as far as I know.
It depends what county you're in.
Okay.
Pennsylvania is actually a pretty large state. So if you're in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, you're going to have amazing access. But organizations have been fighting really hard for that. You have Prevention Point, Project Safe, Philadelphia Fight, Mazzoni Center. There is an LGBT community, a medical community, and a street-based grassroots activism in the city that has been in place for 10, 20 years, really working and striving towards originally dealing with the HIV epidemic. And now that is, though HIV is no longer in the epidemic crisis that it was, now we have the opioid epidemic that is creating increased hepatitis, along with street-based violence and related crime. And so a lot of those organizations are really coming out, and they are being very active in trying to make sure that their resources are getting to the people in need. And we have a lot of mobile clinics, plus we have stationary sites. There are drop-in centers. But if you're not in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, it is not that easy. Though there are services in place, they're part of a different bureaucratic network that is going to be much more acutely punitive and not necessarily as community involved.
Right, and rural areas are just as hard hit as urban areas,
awful,
and you need to have
awful,
these
yeah.
resources available also in rural areas. Feel free to pull the microphone closer to you guys when you're talking,
Yeah,
and we can all maybe squeeze down in a little bit more. And
Yeah, we're friendly.
yeah, we're friendly here. We're friendly here. Sorry, I could have done this setup a little bit better.
The mention of punitiveness made me want to add that sometimes harm reduction is simply stop doing the thing that is making it worse. And I think that we've learned in the case of a lot of our very punitive drug laws, for example, and laws about other like victimless crimes, that that arrest and incarceration is a blunt tool that causes more harm than good. And sometimes the first step in harm reduction is stop hurting people, stop arresting them, traumatizing them, giving them, if not criminal records, then arrest records that go into the paper. And then how are they supposed to take the next step after that if they are, put in that position? And we know that here in Manchester, people die in jail not
Yeah.
people who have not been convicted of a crime die in our jails.
People who don't even have a record of being substance abusers, like it was Jeffrey
Pendleton.
Jeffrey
Jeffrey
Pendleton.
Pendleton.
I still want to know what happened to Jeff Pendleton.
Yeah. Just to explain to Melanie and Eris, Jeffrey Pendleton was an activist. He was a minimum wage activist. He was picked up for marijuana possession. He couldn't make bail. He died a few days later in the Manchester jail,
Valley Street.
Jail.
We've had these cases in Pennsylvania also. Last year I wrote a letter to the Lebanon County Department of Corrections in response to a couple years back an 18-year-old girl went into holding and was not given any assistance while she was going through her withdrawal. She was made fun of and wound up dying of the seizures and the related problems that came from the extreme withdrawal while she was basically being laughed at. When it hit social media, personnel for the Department of Correction actually went on to Facebook and said, why are we even giving this kind of attention to a junkie? She got what she deserved.
Sorry, who said that?
Yes, there are people from the Department of Correction who went onto social media and made despairing comments. And the warden did not get back to my letter, which I wrote from SWAT Behind Bars and Coyote. Unless people are forced to respond to the reality that even, it doesn't matter, it's not even, every person is a person who, no matter what they're experiencing or going through at a moment in time, they have family members and people out there that love them, and we have an obligation to try to see them to the best of their potential and not remove that from possibility. It's part of the street-based outreach and harm reduction is educating people on the value of human life, regardless of what is being viewed at a single moment in time.
Right.
Especially since a lot of the reasoning for incarceration for crimes like that, like drug use or prostitution or anything in that vein is rehabilitation. Like it's if the excuse is rehabilitation or the purpose or part of the stated purpose or the theory of incarceration in those cases is rehabilitation, then it's self-evident that it's not doing its job. So it's interesting that the system has kind of turned against that.
In Arizona, a few years back, there was a prostitute named Marcia Powell. I believe that is correct how I say her name. Whatever the reason was that she was being disciplined as opposed to being put into solitary confinement, she was put into an outdoor cage that gave her direct sun exposure. She wound up dying because of the heat exhaustion. And she had that happen in front of the other prisoners. It's one of the most barbaric things imaginable. But the fact that she was a prostitute is what warranted the disregard for her human life. We are shocked by that. Prostitutes and drug addicts are people. Like I've worked as a prostitute. I've been in the sex trade. I work as a sex work activist. If my life had been disregarded like that, I do hope that somebody would be sitting here now voicing that that's not okay. That's not how we as civilized people in society are supposed to regard each other.
What's really weaving all of this together under harm reduction is it all comes from the grassroots, the clean needle exchange, your decriminalization study for sex work, the acupuncture detox. It's all very grassroots based. So tell us more about your bill and about the subcommittee meeting and tell us more about it.
Sure. So one of the things that I try to do as a rep is find areas where I hope that the left in this state, like the strong leftist organizers who I met through Occupy, for example, and also areas where the libertarians in this state, of whom there are many outspoken libertarians in this state, I try to find areas where we should be working together, where those two groups should be working together. And I think harm reduction, prison reform, criminal justice reform are excellent issues for those two groups to cooperate, because I think we share a lot of the same goals, or at least similar policy prescriptions in those areas. And so that's sort of my filter. That's my first filter, is criminal justice reform related areas. And when Amnesty International published their paper saying we think that governments worldwide need to fully decriminalize sex work for the health and safety of our communities and for the sake of protecting human rights, I said, this seems like a really good issue for me to work on. And I found out that it was also supported by the World Health Organization, the UN Commission on HIV and AIDS, a variety of other groups. It's not an especially controversial position from the standpoint of evidence-based harm reduction. And I knew that it would be pretty controversial from the standpoint of the New Hampshire State House. So I was ready for a long battle, and that's what we're in the middle of right now. It's educating people about how stigma leads to violence, and how arrest is not rescue, and how lots of sex workers and including people who have been trafficked, including minors who have been trafficked, they often do not see police as allies. They see them as dangerous. And I think we have the ability to flip that relationship on its head so that sex workers and law enforcement can work together to identify trafficking victims and to identify people who are engaged in human trafficking. And also, and another benefit would be that sex workers then have access to the medical system, to the legal system. If they're attacked, they can report crimes against them. Right now, sex workers can't do that. If they're raped, they can't call the police because they're just as likely to get arrested as to have a report taken.
Right.
And so it's just a really bad system, and it doesn't help anybody. And black markets are dangerous places. And so, anyway, so what HB 287 would do is create a study committee to have an honest look at the costs and benefits of the current legal system, the current laws against prostitution in this state. And I'm sure there are benefits. There's got to be some kind of benefit. There's always something good and something bad. And the question is, does the bad outweigh the good or not? So that's why I'm a big fan of a cost-benefit analysis of the current system and alternatives, because there are alternatives. We don't have to stick with the status quo if we don't like what it's doing to our families and the women in our communities. So
So if this bill passes, it means that a committee is they're going to meet how often, and what are they going to talk about?
It would create a study committee to gather data, to gather the perspectives of women in the sex trade, both consensual sex workers and women who are not part of the trade.
Oh, we have a caller on line one.
Yeah,
How do we
certainly.
do this?
I don't know.
I've never.
You've never
it
done
might,
this
It might
before?
actually just be Eric. How do we do this?
Whoops. I heard a voice.
Hello? Oh, I didn't mean to. I didn't know how to do this. I'm so sorry. Please call back, caller. Although I think it was Eric, and he can't even watch the show because we don't have cable. He said he'd call in, and he probably wouldn't even know what to ask because he doesn't know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So anyway, right. The bill would create a study committee, but even just the simple idea of a study committee has been very, very threatening.
Yeah. So then who collects the data? Is it legislators?
It would be legislators, or if the committee is turned into a commission, which might happen, like the bill can be amended, then it would be legislators plus stakeholders.
Right.
And I get a little bit uncomfortable about, I just feel like if stakeholders are going to be included, I worry who those stakeholders are going to be.
How do I do this? Go ahead.
Press.
The button that looks like a phone.
I thought I did that one last time.
Yeah.
Go ahead and press it. Hello, you are on the QCC.
Hello.
Hi, Eric.
I was trying to speak with the television audience, television presentation.
Do you have a question for Representative Elizabeth Edwards about her study, her bill to form a study committee on the decriminalization of sex work?
Give me a second. Sorry. Am I talking to Elizabeth?
Yes, you are.
All right. This is totally embarrassing because I was like near the computer and the show is streaming.
Oh.
So there's a delay, obviously. So I had to like walk away from there. And all right. So yeah. Anyway, Elizabeth.
Which one?
Okay. Thank you for representing in the State House, and I wanted to give my appreciations for hearing your discussion of harm reduction. I had a question just to better understand harm reduction. Are there any examples within, like, say, like Manchester Police Department's like practices where there's some harm reduction, some component of that philosophy?
There's a little, but I'm actually not the best person to talk about that. I think you're more familiar with safe stations than I am.
Yeah, absolutely. So the city of Manchester, as well as the city of Nashua, implemented the Safe Station programs, where essentially if anybody is struggling with substance use disorder, they can turn themselves into any of the fire departments, and they're essentially granted amnesty for any drugs or paraphernalia they have on them. The police have taken a position that they do not want any punitive measures. They essentially want these individuals to get into treatment. And so, granting somebody who needs help amnesty from the legal repercussions and getting them into treatment is a huge harm reduction measure, as well as allowing really anybody to carry naloxone, the opioid overdose antidote, at any time, completely decriminalized and even free. I give out naloxone on a pretty regular basis. I keep some with me just to ensure that anybody in our community can help save a life by administering naloxone to anybody who's experiencing an overdose.
Yeah, and those bills were both passed in 2015 and 2016. So I think that some people look at the stats and they say, oh, well, obviously the Anyone, Anytime program, the Narcan, the 911 immunity, it didn't do anything. But the fact of the matter is we don't have the statistics yet. We don't have the overdose death rates yet to show the decline, which I 100% expect to see, because that is what we saw in every other state that changed the laws in that way.
I think that's really impressive that there is a system in place here where people who are in need of help can go to a first responder and state that so clearly. Part of why we are here is because that is exactly what sex workers and sex...
He hung up.
So, sex workers do not have that. There are hotlines to report sex trafficking. Let's say that somebody has been working as a prostitute, whether with coercion or without, but all of a sudden they're like, wow, I'm done, or I just need help and I don't know what to do. They can't go to any of those anti-trafficking organizations and get shelter and services. It's a conflict of interest to have prostitutes or those who identify as sex workers in-house with those who have been rescued because of the privacy issue. It is also felt that there is a protocol for in the rescue model that would be tarnished. So if a prostitute just it wants to get, whether it be treatment or housing or temporary shelter, not even permanent, there's just no structure for them to do that. So sex work friendly support services are part of what we're trying to introduce, but we can't do that with the criminalization intact as it is. because just by saying that you're a prostitute, you are potentially incriminating yourself and your peers in a way where you can't guarantee what the outcome will be, if there will be a benefit to that. You may be jeopardizing the safety and welfare of people around you. For parents, they could lose their children. And so creating community conversations where we can figure out what these problems are, what the barriers are. And part of that is the language of sex trafficking, sex work, anti-trafficking, and rescue. We know that if people are young, we are not, we're considering that a crisis. We are not saying that if there are young people in the trade, we're looking at that as a gray area. That is something to immediately address. But for adults, we need to start figuring out how to address the issues at hand. And something as rational as being able to go to a first responder and say, hey, I need help. Right there would be huge.
One question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I actually had a question about, so we were discussing, you were discussing what steps would be taken if the study committee would actually come to be. The concern from the meeting today is that the sources of information don't seem to be being checked, and I'm wondering what the role, if there is room for a role of sex workers and sex workers who are also academics, or just like educated, like people who can check sources, who can recommend sources, like proven reliable sources for information, and because it seemed today that there was a big conflagration between good information and comforting information today in the meeting, and I'm very interested in whether or not sex workers will be allowed to have a role in assisting this study process.
Yeah, basically, when a study committee forms, they invite. First of all of their meetings are open to the public. So that means any of us can walk in there and say, I would like to submit this testimony and be heard. And that also means that any other organization.
This will happen in your meeting.
If the study committee is formed, right, which is very contentious, especially with the party that's currently in the majority.
Right. So Republicans are not friendly to this, even though maybe Liberty, I don't know.
Right. So I don't want to be too harsh, but I've had some problems with the Speaker's office not really respecting the committee process, because this bill was passed out of committee 15-1 or 14-1 or something like that.
14-1 was.
Yeah, 14-1. And then the Speaker said that's not an acceptable outcome. You need to vote on it again. And he met with the Republicans, just the Republicans on the committee, some of whom very much support the rights of sex workers to advocate for themselves and organize and, have access to the legal system. And he was in there caucusing with just the Republicans. Of course, that's a closed meeting and we don't know what was said. And then after that meeting, all of the Republicans did vote to reconsider their previous decision. And instead of ITLing the bill, which in New Hampshire means no thank you, we don't like this bill, it's bad.
Inexpedient to legislate.
Instead of doing what the Speaker wanted after reconsideration, which was ITL, the committee as a whole, including a few Republicans, voted to retain the bill, which is why we're still talking about it, even though we're not in session right now, is because this subcommittee was formed to talk about the language of the bill, creating a study committee to look at the issue.
Right, okay.
So that's what I mean by just looking at evidence is an extremely controversial proposition.
Right.
I tried to answer your question and also be somewhat tactful and also be truthful. And sometimes it's hard to manage.
Oh, yeah.
We'd like to think that these are issues that can become like bipartisan as opposed to so polarized.
Right.
And again, creating community conversations, because we want for the environment that our children are going to be stepping out into to be safer than some of the situations we have now, but not at the exclusion of lifestyles that are legitimately fair for people to have the right to explore.
Right. It sounds like the speaker might benefit from some harm reduction training. Sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, the question that I hope people want to answer is, what is honestly the best option?
Mm-hmm.
Like, honestly, if you approach the issue with an open mind, can we do better?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the best option we have?
Mm-hmm.
And whatever the best option is, that's what I would like to happen. I would like, and I have my my conclusions, but I'm willing to change my mind if I'm mistaken about the state of the evidence, and I just ask for that same open-mindedness in other people thinking about this issue. Nobody supports human trafficking. Nobody, if it's actually coercive, lots of things happen under the label of human trafficking that are actually 100% consensual. Like if somebody wants to come to this country and, and they are, and if they pay somebody and then they come in here, like that is, they want to be here. Like, so calling that human trafficking when nobody's rights were violated is a little iffy to me. And also like human trafficking when it's two sex workers working together and protecting each other and screening each other's calls or whatever, that's often called human trafficking. So a lot of things are called human trafficking for the sake of getting federal funding.
Okay.
Which aren't actually human trafficking. But when it comes to actual human trafficking, nobody wants that. Like, nobody wants that. Nobody wants children to be exploited. Nobody wants people to get HIV. Nobody wants, these, like, infections. Nobody wants dirty needles in the playground. Like, nobody wants any of this. And nobody wants more people to be addicted to drugs. So the question is, can we do better? Why do we have all of these problems? Can we reduce them? Can we reduce the harm?
Harm reduction. Harm reduction.
Yeah.
We're really working to figure out ways of creating community conversations for de-escalation of violence. Eris and I co-organized Philadelphia, December 17th, International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. We will be having another event this year. The event is 14 years old and in Philadelphia, has been happening since 2012. What we've done is start requesting permits to be able to be at City Hall and bring that out of subculture community centers and small spaces and into an open space to share the memorial and the reality of the murders that have been happening with other nonprofits, with the general public. And what we found is that, sadly, the media, not only in Philadelphia, but across America, refuses to cover International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. Last year in Rhode Island, it was covered in the press, and that was the first time ever, and the only press in the entire country that was offered. It is recognized all across the world. The problem is that because of criminalization, that there is the police, the relationship that we have with the police regarding the nature of sex crimes and crimes against those in the sex trade there is not a proper working relationship. It is hard to gather the data. People do not want to reveal when somebody has been working as a prostitute for various reasons. The criminalization process contributes to that. It contributes to cold cases that families are still hoping to have resolved. In Philadelphia, we have our memorial in memory of Donna Marie Gentili, who was a Philadelphia runaway who was murdered in San Diego in 1985. It is believed that she was murdered by the police. It was a couple weeks after she testified against police who were forcing sexual favors in exchange for information and also for the right not to be arrested. These are the kind of activities that we want to see eradicated. Donna Marie Gentili was sadly made into a very famous piece of art in that she became a political billboard with her one of the last portraits of her taken, and the words NHI And NHI stands for No Human Involved. That status of murder could be applied to prostitutes, drug addicts, transients, migrant workers, day laborers, people that were ambiguous in their background, their gender, their reason for being somewhere. Part of our goal is we want to break down the walls that create that otherism that allow for anyone to be deemed not a human and for their murder to be placed aside and forgotten.
Sorry, I feel like this side of the conversation is dominating a little bit, but it's so nice for us to have the opportunity to talk about these issues.
Thank you. Yeah.
Where else are you having these community conversations?
Unfortunately, right now, it seems like most of the conversation is happening within nonprofit groups and organizations that are already aimed at trying to help solve the problem. The conversation happens within communities that are already in support of eradicating violence against sex workers, for example, by raising up the status of sex workers to a not disenfranchised status. At least that's what I've noticed from my experience. Is that seems. I ran an event a few years ago for about a year and a half that
a good event.
tried to take the conversation more public by making kind of a recreational, creative speaking event where women in the industry or had dabbled or done once or whatever.
And men. There
were customers, patrons of the industry.
Scantily clad storytelling. It was an open mic that was really, really successful.
Yeah,
You
it
did
was really
good with
great.
that.
But I ended up, part of the reason why I lost my steam for that was because I started to feel like the people who were showing up were people who already supported.
Right.
And like people, like once I got everyone coming who was going to come, it was the same people, almost entirely the same people every single time. And that was very like exhausting for me because I was like, because the stories basically help you realize that like a lot of the stories that people told were relatable to anybody, whether or not they'd been in the industry.
Right.
A lot of the experiences that you have with Johns or with customers in a club are things that you could apply to a waitressing job or a relationship. And these struggles are not so foreign as we think, and they're just
kind of gender disparities.
Right.
so that ended up also, I felt, being too much within the sphere of people who already support. So it's difficult to know how to take the conversation, other than things like this, into the public sphere.
So I've been really blessed in that I came out and began speaking at the 14th, the 2014 International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers in Anchorage, Alaska. And since then, when I returned to Pennsylvania, I presented an adult education discussion on sex work and sex trafficking at the Erotic Literary Salon. It's a very successful open mic in its 9th year, and that's run by Susanna Mayer, who is a PhD sexologist. I have his approach to work with creating educational workshops for seminary students at the Lancaster Seminary, where I am recording discussions on law enforcement assisted diversion, lead, and why sex workers oppose lead and rescue unless they are really required to go through it because of a lack of other options. Diversion court, isolated shelter, situations that the general public has not been aware of. These keywords are starting to come up, and so I've done a series of workshops with the seminary students. I was working with people who are trying to get a project going with the Library of Congress through the American Folk Center, which would have allowed us to gather oral histories of working peoples throughout the state. Unfortunately, what I was told is that it was a little bit too controversial for taxpayer dollars to be invested into, and then it was found that that wasn't really supposed to be said out loud. But I'm going to say it out loud because one of the things is, we do have to do these things grassroots, Private donations are what fuel a lot of it. When asked what is the value of taxpayer money going into these discussions, a prostitute can be anybody, and it could be for a day, it could be for a week, it could be for a month, it could be for a lifetime. It could be your daughter, it could be your mother, it could be your cousin, it could be your maid, it could be your son, it could be your son who's becoming your daughter. There are so many reasons why we need to start opening up to this conversation and understanding it's not just them, it's all of us.
Yeah. Okay, we have 10 minutes. That leaves us open still to talk about so many things.
Yeah, I had a thought that I wanted to share, and now it's gone.
One question I had was about the study committee is if legislators are being asked to gather the data, is there sort of this...
We'll bring them the data.
You're bringing them the data.
We're bringing it to them. We're
Okay,
bringing it to
because
them.
I'm just imagining, like, I'm not going to say any names out loud, but, like, who would ask the most horrible, insensitive questions? And I'm not going to say any names out loud, but, you know, and so I'm wondering, should these legislators be advised to read up on harm reduction before they start having these meetings? Or can you not have that expectation?
I mean, I would love if every legislator read up on harm reduction principles.
Right.
It's not, and I think that a lot of people just get it automatically. Like, yeah, of course we want policies to reduce disease, death, and addiction. Duh. And some people just have this mentality of if you do the crime, you do the time. And it's not like, well, for what benefit? You know, isn't really answered. So
recidivism costs everybody much more money and creates an entire subculture of people who can't work because of the fact that they have these records. That helps no one.
yeah, criminalization of all kinds of behaviors is just it exacerbates income inequality, and it's like, you know, our incarceration rate in this country is insane. What we have, we have like it's worse than any other country in the world. Our incarceration rate, which I'm not really sure why that doesn't make everybody pause and say, what are we doing wrong? We have to change this. It's a moral imperative. So, yeah.
I think there's a lot to the sex work conversation that has nothing to do with law or harm reduction, and that's what's so difficult, is that there are all these
How do you take one piece out?
ephemeral, theoretical, moral, ethical, like, I don't even want to say ethical, but moral barriers, and many of which, I've been talking about this all day, many of which seem very emotional. And you can't evidence away an emotional feeling. You can't evidence away someone who doesn't want to see a society where their husband is allowed to go get a prostitute, and is very angry about the thought of that, or very angry about maybe other feelings of you know, fear in that regard, and that's or even just fear about the souls of people who do it, who provide services, like that kind of like emotional fear is very, and it's very difficult because we're trying to talk about evidence and legal things and the stories of the people that we love and know and want to be safe, and our stories of situations where we weren't safe because of the criminal status of work, where we otherwise would have been safe, and it's very difficult because it's, you know, it's just as much of a wall as everything else, and I think in order to address all of these things, we do have to kind of identify all the levels of resistance that are within cultures, and like you have to identify those things, because then you can't address them and maybe kind of like word your way around them, or put those fears to rest, or try to kind of address that, you know, people are going to behave in ways that you don't want them to behave, and the best way to deal with that is to be able to open discussion with your spouse or with your daughter, and not shut your eyes to it in the name of you know, thousands and thousands of, you know, people being enabled to be raped and harmed and murdered and taken advantage of by the legal system, and it's an interesting topic.
if I could mention a Philadelphia case. A few years ago, there was a young woman in her early 20s who had run an ad on Backpage, and when the customer came, they negotiated 1 hour at a set rate, and he gave her money. And then he called a friend, and I believe it was 3 men, it could have been 4, came over and they gang raped her at gunpoint for multiple hours. When that went to court, the female judge who was overseeing that said that it was not rape because she had consented by negotiating and accepting money. She said it was theft of services, and it was left at that. Part of harm reduction is recognizing that if a violent crime happens to somebody, we need to recognize that that is a violent crime. If they were doing something that is uncomfortable for discussion when that violent crime happened, that's a secondary discussion that has to be taken on. But to say that it's a theft of service because you took any money, right there is so problematic, because the trauma that that woman and the anger that that woman is going to carry, and the message that that sends out to other people, that is part of, putting the fact that it was a Backpage ad. We all know Backpage is basically shut down right now as far as the adult section, so we don't have to go for what Backpage's relevance or validity is. But the fact is, she thought that she had it under control. She thought, I'm doing this, I know how to negotiate it, and she thought she could call the police and that it would be on her side. And even though she was not arrested, as women are in some situations, she was publicly humiliated by the fact that this was a public situation that was in the media, and look at the outcome. And the judge said, but I interpreted the law how I was seeing it. Now it's like, well, how can we start changing those laws? And we realized none of us know. Like, I started calling my representatives. How do I change laws?
So if it was theft of services, was she compensated more money?
No. And on top of that, wouldn't that mean that you support decrim? If you're saying it's a service, so it's a service. No, this is where it gets so murky and people start arguing. Okay, well, let's go back to harm reduction. We don't want anyone to be gang raped, and we don't want them to be blamed for that. We don't want for that kind of violent message to be sent out as something that those men were not penalized. No one should be experiencing that. We're not communicating right. So if we want to start working on how to stop that, we need to figure out, well, what if the laws are saying that that's how that reads, how do we change our laws? And since no one knows this, we're learning this as we go with this grassroots effort. It is so essential to start looking at, like, well, how, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, I'm a Libertarian, I'm a Democrat, I'm an Independent, whatever it is. Right? You're a Socialist Party. We've got like this myriad. We all know that we want to live in a safer, more peaceful society.
We've got 2 minutes, so if people want to learn more, where should they go for information?
Well, from the harm reduction side of things, I know that this conversation might be very depressing that we just had, but syringe service programs are moving forward in New Hampshire, and you can and should get involved. You should go to nhrc.org and come to our event on September 22nd. On September 22nd, go to nhrc.org and register on Eventbrite and learn how you can bring the powers of syringe service programs to your community and reduce the amount of dirty needles in your public areas and reduce the spread of hepatitis and HIV, and there's hope in that area. And if you want to learn more about HB 287, I guess you could follow my Facebook page. That's pretty much what we have right now. And that's facebook.com/Rep Edwards.
Not to be confused with...
It's facebook.com/Rep Edwards. I got it. My dad didn't get it. I got it. So my dad's a representative too.
And then are you affiliated with an organization in Philadelphia, or are you completely grassroots?
I'm affiliated with SWAT Behind Bars, ESPU Philly, the Espler Project. I've done work with Project Safe, and I am a member of the Global Network of Sex Work Projects. Our website is www.dec December17philly.com. That is December17philly.com. There is a contact form there if somebody was to go to the contact form. Besides finding out more about international data and violence against sex workers, I would gladly send them information on the harm reduction successes that we have. And I will say that Project Safe is having an event this coming weekend in Philadelphia at the Dome in front of the Philadelphia Art Museum as part of a public showing of what life on the street is like. And it's all in
30
the
seconds.
narratives of the women experiencing it.
Melanie, Eris, Representative Edwards, Ryan, thank you for coming on the show with me today. I think this
Thank
was
you
a
for
really
having
great
us.
and informative show. So thank you.
Thank you
This is the
so much.
QCC, filling in for John Hopwood, who is still out of the country. I wish you all a very good night and stay involved. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is Nikki Casey with Matt Connerton, Unleashed in the Afternoon, and I am here with U.S. Senator